if we use the word prayer in its very narrow human sense, it's really just a band-aid for a local emergency. But the one word prayer is actually the difference between living in humanhood, isolated from God, and living in oneness with God. The very word prayer is going to be the connecting link which brings the realization of heaven to man of earth. That word prayer is that important. And when you have a different view of the word prayer, you begin to see that you have a weapon, a transforming power. In the Aramaic, the word prayer is slotha, S-L-O-T-H-A, a very revealing word. It became prayer in the Greek, and then finally prayer in the English. But in slotha, you have a meaning that has never been delved into, to my knowledge. Now, slotha in Aramaic means to pray. It also means to make an adjustment, and the derivative sla, from which it comes, means a very interesting thing. It means to hunt. To hunt. To set a trap, and after you set the trap, you go and you hide somewhere in a secret place, and you wait quietly and patiently until you catch what you set the trap to catch. And this begins to give us a clue as to the meaning of prayer. You set the situation in such a way that you could receive something, capture something, and then you quietly waited. This was a slotha, or a prayer. And what are we trying to capture? To receive the light of God. And how do you catch it? By quietly standing in the corner, waiting patiently for God to make the contact with you. We have a new concept of prayer right there. And it was in that concept that the word there was used. When the disciples were told how to pray, how to receive God, and that secret place to hide, to listen. And then again, in the Sermon on the Mount, we were told not to get in the synagogues and pray like the hypocrites so that everybody could see us and boast our own vanity and self-esteem to show them how religious we were, but to get off somewhere in your own closet. And again, the very word prayer, to retire and wait, to listen, to develop the inner ear. Oh, what a different form of prayer that is than saying, "Dear God, $300 by Tuesday, please." And then we're giving little hints about it. But here is the biggest point of the Lord's Prayer. And we sort of have to feel our way into this, because it's delicate, and you have to take it in context. You can't just take this Lord's Prayer over here and say, "That's it now," pass it out to people and say, "Follow this." It has to be seen in the whole evolution of the Bible. You go way back to the Tower of Babel when you see that men couldn't do things with their own thoughts. The minute they got into man-made brick instead of stone and slime instead of mortar, the tower shattered. They were trying to build out of their own thoughts. Prayer is the same. We're being taught that you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, which is this level of consciousness, this fourth dimension. You cannot enter it unless you change. God will not change. We must change. And just to go to God and say, give, isn't it. We must change. We must prepare. We're not even ready to pray. We're simply not prepared to pray. First, there must be a change, a purification. There must be an unconditioning so that the mind is an empty vessel. The old man must die. The new man must be reborn of the Spirit. And in this change, this transformation, we are raised to a level which our human mind cannot conceive, but which the Father has already conceived. And so in the Lord's Prayer, we are surrendering our humanhood, laying it right down on the line and saying, Father, I don't need it anymore. There's no me. There's you. And now I'll be your right arm or your left foot. Whatever you want me to be, I will be. Through me as the instrument, you will function unmolested by my human thought. I won't interfere. I won't direct you this way or that way or try to channel God. And I'm letting you draw me beyond my present capacities. Thy kingdom, thy will, on earth as it is in heaven. I'm earth. My consciousness is earth. Your consciousness is heaven. How can I tell you? And so this is putting yourself into a total consciousness that accepts God as your consciousness, and as you're lifted up, a moment before there were all these things you wanted to say, God, get rid of them, please, but now you're not doing that, and instead you're being lifted up, 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 and as you look out, after having been lifted up, they're not there anymore. And you didn't have to say, God, get rid of them. You had to say, God, take me into your consciousness. Lift me, quicken my spirit. This is my prayer, to be one with you. I'm seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these little things that I wanted done, they're going to be added things. They're going to be done. They've got to be done. And the reason is they only exist in my mind. The kingdom of God is the only creation there is, and our false concept of it is the very things we normally go to God and say, heal them up. But now we're lifted out of this false sense of reality. We are transformed by the renewing of this mind. And in this transformation, we are changing. The man of yesterday I am no longer. Today I am a new man. Tomorrow I'm going to be a new one again. I'm not clinging to the daily manna. My daily bread tomorrow will be different than today. There will be a new unfoldment. We're being taught that God is not stagnant, and that we, to run in the rhythm of God, must let ourselves be as unstagnant as God and let the Father flow, 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 so that our spirit is continually flowing into higher mansions. It cannot flow when we're asking God for things. Ask, knock, seek, but for what? For things of this world? How can you? If the kingdom of God is not this world, how ridiculous to go to God and say, give me some things in this world. Of a truth, says Peter, God is no respecter of persons. We're flying right through that as if he didn't say it. I'm asking God to respect me as a person. But he won't. He can't. There's no me as a person in his eyes. I do not exist as a human being in the eyes of God. Nor do you. You do exist as his child, his divine son. And his divine son doesn't have to ask for anything because, Son, all that I have is thine. In you is embodied the fullness of God. Shall we now turn around and say, God, thank you for all you've given me, for that allness? And P.S., take care of this little detail you overlooked. Now then, the secret of life is revealed in this prayer. But most of us are not ready for it. We want pleasant comforts. We want to have the things of this world. We want the peace. We don't want the sword. But it's that very inertia in us, that quality of sitting back and thumbing our suspenders and saying, now I've got what I want. It's that quality that is being attacked by this prayer. It is saying you never have anything you want because you have no wants. There's no you to have them. There is God. And God's will, God's plan, God's blueprint must flow. No matter what you get today, tomorrow you must be poor in spirit again. You must be so poor that you need God this day to decide what you should do. And now we're beginning to catch the Lord's Prayer in a different light. Its purpose is to lift us into the high consciousness in which we inherit the earth. Not a Band-Aid, the earth. Our meekness must be such that we totally surrender the personal sense of self, and then we're in the Lord's Prayer. Then we're acknowledging the Father and letting his name be hallowed. Then we're saying, thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory. But more than that, we are attaining our reality. Instead of settling for a comfortable, successful human being filled with self-righteousness and self-love and self-esteem, happy to hear the applause of the multitudes, we are being lifted into Christhood. And no other prayer is ever going to attain, for you or for me or for anyone on earth, the presence of God, the experience of God, than this acknowledgement that I am already complete in God and there's nothing I have to ask for. Nothing. Now, instead of calling God a liar, impotent, indifferent, withholding, I say, Father, I'm seeing this situation incorrectly. That's what's wrong down here. I'm looking at it with these two eyes, 20/20 vision. And I'm looking at the infinite. And I might as well try to pour a camel through a keyhole. Naturally, I'm missing it. Lift me into your vision is all I'm asking. And so we're in a state of oneness, a state of divine realization. And finally, please try to see that this is the real purpose behind the Lord's Prayer. That prayer is not going to God for anything, not even for God. Not even for God. Prayer is the way you live. Prayer isn't this moment of turning to God. Prayer is living. The way you live is your prayer. If you're living in the realization of the omnipresence of God, you're praying. And you must do it every single second. You must live with that realization that God is here now in the midst of me. We're not two. There's no me and God. There's no God in me. God is individual being. And as I live in that realization, willing to accept the consequences of it, and to stare down every evil without wincing or complaining or beseeching or supplicating, in the realization that the evil represents my full sense of the reality of God, then I'm praying. As I recognize the reality of God in all things, I am praying. And that prayer is the Lord's Prayer. Our secret place, of course. It isn't the human mind. What we've been doing up to now is making mental contact, we think. And you can't make mental contact with God. Just as the natural man receiveth not the things of God, God doesn't receive the things of the natural man. We can talk our heads off. God didn't hear a word we said. Not one word. It seems that prayers are answered. But you know, something really happens that's quite different than the prayer being answered. There is a moment in a deep crisis when an individual completely loses sense of self. And that's when the healing occurs. It's not an answer to a prayer. It's the removal of the sense of self. Dear God, help me, and the woman is powerless and her mind is paralyzed. Something happens. Not that God answers the prayer. There was no prayer to answer. The perfection was always there, invisibly inherent in whatever the condition was. The veil is lifted by that individual's dropping out of the state of mind they were in. Sometimes when they go in a coma, it helps. When they're unconscious, it helps. When they fall asleep, it helps. And if you've been doing any healing work, you know that you'll work like the devil. And the next thing you know, the patient's sound asleep. But when they wake up, oh, they feel wonderful. That mind was sleeping, that's all that happened. That little buzzsaw that was perpetuating the problem is gone. And so they healed. There's nothing to be healed of, except the belief that there's something to heal. I made a little list for us about prayer. We have to stop accusing God of an imperfect universe. We have to remember that God won't change, that we had better change. As we are, we cannot come into contact with God. Oh, there are exceptions here and there. Thank heaven for them. But basically, I'm talking with the human race. As we are, we cannot come into contact with God. We must be prepared. We must first be lifted in consciousness. As a matter of fact, man, humanly, will never be able to contact God, nor God speak to man. The intermediary is the Christ. And so there must be a realization of the Christ of your being, and the Christ is one with God. Our transformation, then, is from human being, which is the false sense of self, to the light of God, the Spirit of God, the Christ of God, which is the true sense of self now, if we but had that sense of self. This transformation is achieved not by you, but by God. And by your ability to remain in a state of receptivity to God in your secret place of the Most High, in your closet, and thus to receive from God His prayer. And when you receive His prayer, you have prayer, because His prayer is truth. God is functioning right now, regardless of any evil condition that you find yourself in. God is functioning now, and your recognition of it is freedom from the condition. You express your recognition by the removal of fear, the feeling of the peace of the presence of God, the courage to stand there in the presence of the condition and to be saying within yourself, peace, it is I. Right behind this condition stands the Father smiling. And though I cannot see Him, feel Him, touch Him, He is omnipresent, and the condition represents the mirage of my mind. There's no exception. Now let's go back to Jesus and see that He never prayed to God, but His prayer consisted of acknowledging not the problem for 1 second. Doesn't matter if you're a cripple, pick up your bed. You're not a cripple in God's eyes or mine, and I and the Father are one. Walk. Now this instantaneous God, the awareness of the instantaneity of God, was His secret weapon, wasn't it? That God is here. There is nothing else. And so if there are 5,000, what of it? It could have been 10. And because there's nothing but God, there's no dead Lazarus. And finally, there's no dying me. Put me wherever you want. I'm not going to die. God is. And nothing else. And that great line, if you believe on me and the works that I do, greater works shall ye do. Now then, Jesus did not pray in the human sense. And yet, everything He did was prayer, because His life was a prayer. Prayer is the receptivity to the presence of God in your midst. And He said, I and the Father are one. That was His prayer. I and the Father one. And when this is our prayer, we're praying without ceasing. We're abiding, we're dwelling in the presence of God. And that's the only prayer you ever need. We cannot pray from fear, from untruth, or from human desire. You are not praying when you speak your thoughts or you think your thoughts. That is not prayer. The speaking of your thoughts or the thinking of them is not prayer. Prayer is recognition of the presence of God where you are. God can do nothing to matter. God can do nothing to evil. God can do nothing to disease. God did not create a material universe. He created a spiritual universe. And as we learn to drop our material sense of His spiritual universe, we'll see there's nothing there to heal. Matter of fact, this is what hurts to say so many times, but those of you who know it won't flinch. This is not God's world, that's all. And so to ask Him to improve anything in this world is destined to failure. This is God's kingdom. And there's nothing in His kingdom to be improved. The improvement is always within us, within our power of realization. And that has been why we have been unable to pray successfully, We've always thought God ought to improve something, never dreaming that what had to be improved was our power of seeing truth. That's where egotism got in our way. If we could have only seen that if there was anything wrong, God would have fixed it long before we got around to telling him. If we could have only seen how impudent that was, we would have said, well, how could God wait for me? It must be that it's all right, but I can't see it. But you see, the human ego wouldn't permit that. Now then, as we go through deeper into the mystical Bible, we have a golden thread called transformation. We must be willing, first, to see that nothing is possible without a change in consciousness. We must be willing to make whatever human sacrifices are necessary to attain that change of consciousness if we wish to attain a measure of the presence of God in our experience. Now, we have been given firm, clear, flawless principles which will enable us to attain the change of consciousness which lifts us into the fourth dimension. It may be straight and narrow, but this is the time to know that, because if you're not prepared to roll up your sleeves spiritually and sort of brush through the thorns and take your chances, there's really no way to attain this higher consciousness. It's not the easiest thing in the world. It's for those who feel the touch of the Spirit. Only those would have the tenacity to go forward. The others would say, well, we're doing all right, $20,000 a year, home's almost paid for, only got 12 more years to live, 15 years to live. Why not just play golf? And that person should, you know. That person should. It's only those who have an unrest in their soul, you might say, a sort of a yearning that can't be labeled, who know that this is something I must do. Maybe I've spent 20 or 30 years doing other things, getting my golf game down in the 70s or 80s. Maybe I've seen all the TV shows I want to see. Maybe I've read all the books I want to read. I've been to all the foreign countries I want to see. Maybe now it's inner space I'm interested in. That person is ready for the mystical Bible. This is only our third lesson. We were supposed to go high as this, maybe in our 10th lesson. But now, inasmuch as we've reached the point where it should be clear to each of us that unless you're prepared to undergo a transformation, this is not your message. Those who finally do decide, yes, I'm ready for a transformation, well, you may soon call yourselves disciples. And it's going to take a certain kind of discipline to be a disciple. And those of you who, in a sense, already have passed the point of making that decision, already have passed the point of conscious oneness with God, are in that state every day of your lives, you will be the leaven of this class. you will lift us all up with you. And together we have a spiritual pilgrimage which is going to be quite different than a pious, sanctimonious march to a Holy Grail. Perhaps out of this class will come a new light for this city, this state, this world. Perhaps out of this class you will find a greater depth of spiritual consciousness than any of us would dare to dream at this moment. We might find 10 righteous men. But I'm telling you now, it's not peace, it's a sword. But it's a sword in which God does the wielding of the sword. And so you know it's a sword of love. I don't exactly know the next lesson. I never do. I didn't know about prayer until late this week. But it was clear that prayer had to be done today. But we're ready for another mansion. And so you're invited to the next mansion next week. If we can now, let's see the Lord's Prayer as it was intended. A self-surrender to the God of your own being, to the God in your midst, to that imperishable flame within you. That's where you're surrendering. Because that's where God is. Let's be one. Thank you.